Why don't you do the intro?
Me?
No, the guy sitting next to you.
Hey, welcome back to Daily Devotions with Dad. I'm Philip.
I'm Seth.
He's God.
Who's God? Me?
He is.
Oh, he's God, right.
And we're not.
And we're not. Sorry. I didn't do very good. How are you, Philip?
Good.
Yeah.
You, Dad?
I'm pretty good. And I do also want to welcome you back to Daily Devotions with Dad. Today we are going to, I'm with Philip obviously, and we're going to do another devotion from the Institute for Creation Research's Days of Praise. But before I get started, I want to make sure I tell you or ask you, beg you, plead with you.
Beseech you.
Beseech you. That's a good word, Philip.
We learned about that word in Sunday school last Sunday.
All right. Well, we want to beseech you to please click the subscribe button down below if you haven't already. And once you've done that, click the little bell icon that pops up. And oh, did you hear that?
What?
The ding.
No?
Oh. This doesn't all happen at the same time. That's okay.
What'd you just whisper?
You'll see. Anyway, that bell icon, that will that'll make sure that you get notified when we post new videos. So assuming you want to see more videos, which you know you do. Don't they know they do?
Yeah.
Yeah, of course they do. How could you look how cute this guy is, right? Well, today we're going to talk about God's shadow. Now, I told you yesterday that I was skipping the current Days of Praise. I didn't tell you. But we're skipping it because it has to do with a hymn. And I need to work out with Mom how to do those. Because I think we ought to do them by the piano so we can sing and talk about them and whatnot, verse by verse. So today I picked a devotion from earlier in the month, which we didn't do. And I picked it very specially for Philip. Do you know why I picked this devotion for you?
Why? Because John 3:16's in this?
No, it's called, what's it called?
God's shadow.
God's shadow. And what do you think about shadows, Philip?
I'm sort of scared of
He's sort of
darkness.
scared of darkness and shadows and shadow
Not
monsters.
shadows.
Shadow monsters. Which look just like shadows. Right? That's what makes them so scary. Well, we're going to do this devotion on God's shadow because I hope it helps you to think, well, if I'm seeing a shadow I'm scared of, I can just pretend it's God's shadow. But I haven't read this either, so let's see what it's about. Philip, our text today is from the book of Lamentations, chapter 4, verse 20. Would you read that for us?
The breath of our nostrils, the anointed of the Lord, was taken in their beds, of whom we said, under his shadow we shall live among the
heathen. Yeah, it looks like heaven, so you would say
heaven.
But it's heathen is the word. All right. So Lamentations do you know who Lamentations was written by?
Jeremiah the prophet. Is that right?
Why, yes. Yes, he was. Yes, it was. Good job. Wow. I didn't expect you to know that. Do you know under what circumstance he wrote the book of Lamentations?
No.
Okay. So in 586, God bless you.
Thank you.
In 586 BC, the Babylonians came in and conquered Israel, and they took all of the people out of Israel, and they went back to Babylon. That's where yeah, that's where, well, I don't know about all. A lot of them. They
I was like, how can they They get
No,
all.
they that's one of the things the Babylonians did. They would take the people and they take all the people out of land and they would put their people there. And that way they sort of mixed everything up. And that's covered in the book of Jeremiah, and we get
Lamentations?
Lamentations. And we get the book of Daniel comes from that time. Ezra and Nehemiah come right after that. That period when after they leave the captivity in Babylon, may they go back to Jerusalem. You studied this in Nehemiah recently, didn't you? What is Nehemiah about? Do you remember? Building the wall? Did
It
you
was
talk
a
about
long
that?
time ago, and yeah,
Oh, okay.
it was the wall.
It was building the wall once they got back
Once
to...
it was Legos, I was literally building a wall.
Yeah. So Lamentations is written about the time that they were taken off into Israel, okay, or into Babylon. So when it says they were, the breath of our nostrils, the anointed of the Lord, was taken in their pits, of whom we said, under his shadow we shall live among the heathen. So they're talking about going into captivity, because Jeremiah had prophesied they were going to go into captivity. And so he's talking about that. Let's read what Dr.
John Morris?
No, Dr. Henry Morris says about this. He says, in the hot desert lands so familiar to the Israelites, a place of shade was considered a blessing wherever it could be found.
Wherever
It could be found. Yeah, when you're out in the sun, you're thankful for shade. Yeah, a little bit of coolness. And this was often taken as a symbol of God's protection from the hot hatred of their and his enemies. In other words, they used shadow as a way of describing, just like an actual tree will cast a shadow that you can sit under and be protected from the heat of the sun. The Israelites used the word shadow to refer to God's protection of them from their enemies. In fact, it says the Hebrew word for shadow is used 12 times in the Bible.
Where does it say that?
Right here. It says, in fact, the Hebrew word for shadow is used 12 times in the Bible as a type, in other words, as a way of talking about God's guarding presence. The first of those 12 references to shadow as a type of God's guarding presence is in Psalm 17:8. And it says, keep me as the apple of the eye, hide me under the shadow of your wings. Does God have wings? No, he doesn't have wings. No, he doesn't have wings. Saying that God has wings is what's called, you ready for a big word?
Yeah.
It's called an anthropomorphism. Anthropomorphism. Can you say that?
Anthropomorphism?
Anthropomorphism, that's right. And that comes from a couple Greek words. One is anthro, which, do you know what anthro means?
No,
Do you know what? Have you ever heard of anthropology? If I told you that anthropology was the study of mankind, what would you say anthro means? It means man. Anthro means man. And then morphism, you've heard of morphing. You know what morphing is, right? Changing one thing into another.
Like morphosis?
Like metamorphosis is like changing of something into something else, right? So anthropomorphism means that we take God and we sort of change him into a man so that we can understand him. We anthropomorphize God so that we can understand him. So we say God has hands, right? He holds us in his hands. God doesn't have hands. He's God. He's a spirit. There aren't hands.
Or
right?
feet?
Or feet, or wings, or eyes, or a nostril, or anything like that. God is God.
Or ears?
Or ears. He can't incline his ear toward us. These are all anthropomorphisms. They are using words that are related to people to talk about God, not because they're true, but because they help us understand something about God. It's not true that God has hands. It is true that God cares for us as if he was holding us in his hands. Does that make sense? Kind of makes sense?
It's really confusing.
If we were talking about your swimming, and this boy is a fish.
Me?
Are you a fish?
No.
Well, why did I say that?
Because I'm really good at swimming.
And everybody knows that I meant that, right? They didn't think I meant you were a fish.
They see me not as a fish.
Well, right. And this is Daily Devotions with Dad, not Daily Devotions with Aquarium Owner. Right? So, we say fish. That's doing an ichthyomorphism, making you like a fish, so that people understand something about you. When I say you're a fish, everybody takes that to mean you can swim really well. See what I mean?
Really well.
So when the psalmist said, "Hide me under the shadow of your wings," he's drawing a picture, right? A picture of a person or a being with his wings outspread, like covering. This is like protective, isn't it? If I'm doing this, or I'm wrapping something around you, I'm shielding you, right? I'm protecting you. So that's what the psalmist is doing. 3 other times the shadow of thy wings is used in Psalm 36, 57, and 63. That's 4. Isaiah speaks of his presence as the shadow of a great rock in a weary land. And again, we talked about what that's like to be in a weary land, like wandering out in the desert, right?
Where does it say that? Excuse me.
This is Isaiah 32. His presence is as a shadow of a great rock in a weary land. In other words, when we're weary and tired and exhausted, God is a respite. He's protection. He's a comfort. When you've been out wandering in the sun all day, to be able to sit under a great big rock's shadow is relaxing. It's cooling. It's comforting, right?
Or a tree.
Or a tree, anything that casts a shadow. And he's like being hidden in the shadow of his hand. Again, God doesn't have a hand, just like you're not fish, right? God doesn't have a hand, but it draws a picture. Like if this screw was you, right? The shadow of your hand, God can like cover you and protect you, right? The Lord is compared to a tabernacle for a shadow in the daytime from the heat, or for a place of refuge, and for a covert from storm and from rain. A covert is like a hiding place, a shelter. Okay, so God again is a tabernacle or a shelter that you can be inside of for the shadow in the daytime. In other words, protecting you from heat. He's cooling. Anyway, he is the shadow from the heat, and like the shadow of a cloud, again from Isaiah. The last reference to God's shadow is in our text. That's the Lamentations chapter 4, verse 20. And it's in reference to the forced exile, we were talking about this, of God's people into Babylon. In this sad context, Jeremiah laments that even the anointed of the Lord, that is literally the Lord's Messiah, who would ultimately be fulfilled in Jesus Christ, had been taken captive with his people. He is even called the breath of our nostrils, recognizing implicitly that it was he who breathed into man's nostrils the breath of life in the beginning. Do you remember that? That's way back in
Acts?
Well, no, it's back in Genesis originally. In Acts, Paul talks to the Athenians, the people who lived in Athens, on a hill. He's talking to them, and he says, "God that made the world and all things therein, he is the Lord of heaven and earth. He dwells not in temples made with hands, neither is worshipped with men's hands, as though he needed anything, seeing that he gives to all life and breath and all things." So even the breath in our lungs comes from God himself. Thus, he will even be with his people as they undergo their just chastisements, that can even live among the heathen under his shadow. So they're going to live in Babylon with people who don't like them, right? But even in that place, Jeremiah is praising God that they will be able to say, under his shadow we shall live among the heathen. Even in that place of exile, taken out of Israel, taken out of the land that they had been promised, they can still live under his shadow. In other words, they can live within his protection. No matter how dark our circumstances, we can say with the psalmist, "He that dwells in the secret place of the Most High shall abide under the shadow of the Almighty. In him will I trust." So when you see a shadow, you shouldn't think about shadow monsters. You should think, the shadow is a good example of God's protection. Or you can think about God's hand.
Or like that shadow.
Or like that. That's actually a shadow monster.
I knew you were joking.
I know. Think about God's protection being like a shadow cast over you. In fact, in the middle of the night, if you see a shadow in your room and you're afraid, just thank God that He's protecting you. And maybe that shadow is actually a reminder to you that God is there. That's a pretty nice thought, isn't it? All right. Well, hey, thanks so much for joining us again today for Daily Devotions with Dad. This little man is Philip. He's
Seth.
And he's God.
And we're not.
We're not. And neither are you. You. We both point, right? Thanks again for joining us. God bless, and we'll talk to you next time.
Bye.